There is a particular kind of person who has noticed, usually years after the fact, that people from their past resurface in strange, disproportionate ways. An old classmate who still remembers a comment made once in passing, an ex who reappears long after any reasonable timeline for moving on, a former co-worker who brings them up in conversations they were never part of. This person rarely suspects the reason, not because they lack self-awareness, often the opposite. They assume, reasonably enough, that they simply weren't that memorable. What they haven't yet considered is that memorability was never really the mechanism at all. Being unforgettable does not look like charisma most of the time. It does not require brilliance, beauty, or any of the qualities people usually credit for leaving an impression. It looks, instead, like something quieter and considerably stranger, the simple act of making someone feel a version of themselves they cannot access anywhere else. And the truly unsettling part is this: you may never fully know which version that was, because the person carrying the memory of you is usually the only one who ever saw it clearly. Carl Jung spent decades studying what he called the anima and animus, the unconscious inner images each person carries of a wholeness they have not yet integrated. What Jung understood, and what gets left out of most conversations about connection, is that certain people, without ever intending to, become living symbols of that unintegrated part in someone else's psyche. Some people are forgotten quickly because they matched expectations exactly. Others are remembered indefinitely because they didn't, because they revealed a possibility the other person hadn't yet given themselves permission to want. That kind of memory is not sentimental. It is unfinished business. And unfinished business does not fade the way ordinary memory does. This is where most people's understanding of being remembered fails them. They imagine it as a compliment about themselves, proof of their own value or magnetism. But the truth underneath most of these lingering memories is considerably less about you specifically, and considerably more about what you happen to represent at the exact moment someone encountered you. You were not necessarily extraordinary. You were, more precisely, correctly timed. You don't understand why certain people never fully let you go because you're looking for something impressive you did. What actually happened is quieter and stranger than that. A person carries, usually without conscious awareness, an image of who they could be if certain parts of themselves were finally permitted to exist, more honest, more alive, less careful, less afraid. When they meet someone who embodies even a fragment of that image, something activates that has very little to do with attraction in the conventional sense and everything to do with recognition. This is not coincidence. It is projection finding its target, and projection, once it finds a suitable surface, does not release its grip easily, regardless of what actually happens between the two people afterward. And here is the part that is difficult to sit with. The people who linger longest in someone else's memory are rarely the ones who tried hardest to be memorable. They are often the ones who were simply, unself-consciously, themselves, in a moment when the other person badly needed to witness that it was possible. Their impact was not a performance. It becomes tangled in the other person's mind, with an entire unlived possibility, and possibilities, once glimpsed, are far harder to forget than facts. Not because you did anything remarkable, but because being remarkable was never actually required. Being real, at the right moment, in front of the right person, was enough to become permanently lodged in someone's unconscious as evidence that a different life was available. You didn't build that accusation on purpose. You just happened to be standing there, being yourself, while someone else was quietly grieving a version of themselves they never got to try. There is a moment in these dynamics that almost everyone who has been on either side recognizes, though rarely names correctly at the time. It usually feels, from the outside, like unusually strong chemistry, an intensity that seems to arrive faster and land harder than the actual circumstances would explain. Two people who have known each other only briefly feel oddly significant to one another. What is actually happening, more often than either person realizes, is that one or both of them have encountered a mirror for something unintegrated, and mirrors, unlike ordinary encounters, do not fade at the normal rate memory usually allows for. This is the part almost no one wants to accept. Feeling intensely connected to someone is not the same as truly knowing them. It can be the exact same sensation, intensity, wearing a completely different function underneath, recognition rather than actual intimacy. The unconscious mechanics of this rarely begin with anything dramatic. They begin with contrast, a moment where you did something the other person has never once given themselves permission to do, left a situation they would have stayed in, said a true thing they would have softened, wanted something openly that they have only ever wanted secretly. Each of these moments, small as they seem to you, can land in someone else's psyche as evidence of an entire alternate way of being. The human mind, wired to notice sharp contrast far more than gradual similarity, will fixate on these moments precisely because they stand out against a lifetime of the opposite pattern. This is not a flaw in anyone's character. It is a feature of how the unconscious organizes significance, weighting rare exceptions far more heavily than common occurrences for the entire span of human psychological development. It simply was not designed to distinguish between someone who is actually central to your life and someone who briefly illuminated a possibility you have not yet acted on. There is a related pattern worth naming here, because it shows up more often than people expect, and it involves timing rather than personality at all. Certain encounters happen at what might be called a threshold moment, right before a major decision, right after a loss. In the narrow window, when someone is unconsciously searching for permission to change direction in their life. A person met during that window can become disproportionately significant, not because of who they actually are, but because they happen to arrive at the exact hinge point where an old identity was already loosening its grip. You could have been almost anyone with the right quality of presence, and the moment would have attached itself to you regardless. This is uncomfortable to consider because it suggests some of what feels like a unique bond was, in part, a matter of appearing at the right coordinates on someone else's timeline. Once this kind of fixation forms, it tends to calcify rather than fade, because the person carrying it rarely has any incentive to resolve it. Resolving it would require confronting the actual unlived part of themselves directly, doing the difficult work of building the courage, or the honesty, or the self-permission that you appeared to embody without visible effort. It is considerably easier, psychologically, to keep the memory of you intact and unresolved than to do that work, so the memory gets preserved instead, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, essentially unchanged, because an unresolved projection does not require updating the way a real relationship would. This has a name in psychological language, though it rarely gets applied to memory specifically. Arrested symbolic content. What it actually describes is a piece of another person's unconscious that got assigned to you and then simply stopped developing, frozen at the moment of encounter, because the actual growth it represented never happened inside them. You are not being remembered as you actually are. You are being preserved as a symbol of something they still haven't done. Jung believed that psychological health depended on individuation, integrating disowned parts of the self rather than outsourcing them permanently to other people. A person who cannot forget you is very often, without realizing it, someone who has failed at this specific task in relation to whatever you represented, and continues failing at it for as long as the memory stays vivid rather than resolved. This is not your responsibility to fix. It does explain, however, why the intensity of their memory can feel so disproportionate to the actual length or depth of whatever happened between you. There is a particular version of this worth naming directly, because it explains a pattern many people notice but rarely understand. Sometimes the person who cannot forget you was never someone you were especially close to at all, a brief acquaintance, a stranger at a specific moment, someone encountered for a single conversation that somehow lodged permanently in their memory, while you, understandably, barely registered the interaction as significant. This asymmetry feels confusing from the outside, but it makes complete sense once you understand that memory intensity in these cases has almost nothing to do with the objective significance of the encounter, and everything to do with the internal state of the person doing the remembering. You happen to arrive during a moment when they were unusually primed to receive whatever you were carrying. The timing, not the relationship, did most of the work. This also explains why the memory rarely responds to reality. If you were to run into that person years later and reveal yourself to be, in all the ordinary ways, simply human, flawed, inconsistent, unremarkable in the way everyone eventually is, the memory they carry would likely resist that correction. Projected images are notoriously resistant to being updated by evidence because the image was never really built from evidence to begin with. It was built from need, and need does not update easily just because reality offers a contradiction. There is a specific quiet that develops in people who eventually realize they have become someone else's unresolved symbol without their consent. It is not the quiet of someone who wanted this kind of significance. It is the quiet of someone slowly understanding that being remembered this intensely was never really a form of being known. You may feel, on some level, an obligation to that memory, a pull to respond when that person resurfaces, a guilt at seeming to disappoint an image you never actually agreed to represent. That pull is not incidental. It is the natural response of a decent person confronted with the fact that someone built an entire private meaning around them without ever asking permission first. People who carry this kind of fixation, particularly the ones who have never examined it, rarely announce what they are actually asking for when they resurface. They ask if you're doing well. They mention they think of you sometimes. What is actually happening underneath these ordinary-sounding messages is considerably larger, a check-in with the unresolved part of themselves that you happen to symbolize, disguised as simple curiosity about your life. There is a particular kind of pressure in being on the receiving end of this. You cannot point to anything you did wrong because you didn't do anything wrong. There was no manipulation on your part, no promise made and broken, nothing that would justify the emotional weight being placed on an interaction you may barely remember in the same detail they do. There is only the strange experience of realizing you have been cast, without audition, in the leading role of someone else's unfinished internal story. This is what unresolved projection actually produces in the person carrying it, not necessarily obsession in the dramatic sense, but a specific, recurring, wistful attention that never quite converts into anything actionable. They rarely pursue anything real with you, because pursuing something real would risk discovering you are not actually the thing they need you to be. It is safer, psychologically, to keep you at the exact distance where the symbol stays intact. The person who cannot forget you is very often, underneath the nostalgia, still protecting themselves from becoming whatever you represented, because becoming it might mean admitting how much of their life was organized around not becoming it. Keeping you as a distant, unresolved memory is considerably safer than doing the work your example implicitly demanded of them. This dynamic is efficient precisely because it borrows the other person's own unlived potential as its fuel source. They do not need you to do anything further. The memory sustains itself because every time they think of you, they are really encountering the part of themselves that still hasn't been given permission to exist, and that encounter, while uncomfortable, has its own strange pull, the way people are drawn back repeatedly to unfinished business, even when finishing it would clearly serve them better. Here is where the more interesting question surfaces, the one worth sitting with rather than simply flattering yourself over. If someone's memory of you depends this heavily on what you represent rather than who you actually are, what does that suggest about the moments in your own life when you have done the same thing to someone else? Held onto an image of a person long after they stopped being that image, kept someone in a kind of permanent psychological amber because updating the memory would have required grieving a possibility you weren't ready to let go of. This is not the same as saying you are equally responsible for whatever someone else built around you. That distinction matters and should never be blurred. But there is a difference between blame and understanding requires recognizing that nearly everyone carries at least one person like this, someone whose actual present life you know almost nothing about, preserved instead as a symbol of a door you once stood in front of and did not walk through. For many people, tracing their own version of this back reveals the same mechanism working in the other direction. A former teacher who once said something that unlocked a version of ambition never fully pursued. A friend from years ago who modeled an ease around vulnerability, never quite replicated since. These people, too, are probably living ordinary, complicated, unremarkable adult lives, completely unaware of the outsized role they still play in your internal architecture. Jung would have said that this exchange, everyone quietly holding unresolved fragments of everyone else, is simply how the unconscious operates in relationship, borrowing external people as temporary placeholders for internal work that has not yet been done. It is rarely deliberate, and it is never really about the actual person being held onto, memory-wise, in this frozen, symbolic way. There is a gentler version of this same principle that shows up not in old flames or brief acquaintances, but in the ordinary passage of family life, and it deserves mention because it softens the whole idea considerably. A parent may carry an idealized memory of a child's early, uncomplicated affection, long after that child has grown into someone more complex and less available. A grown child may carry an idealized memory of a parent's strength, long after that parent has become someone frailer and more human. These are not projections built from lack in the same corrosive sense. They are simply evidence that love, too, tends to freeze its favorite frame and resist updating it, which suggests this mechanism is not inherently a sign of dysfunction. It is closer to a universal feature of how memory and attachment interact, gentler in some relationships, more consequential in others, but always working the same basic way underneath. Recognizing this changes what you do the next time someone resurfaces carrying an old, disproportionate significance toward you. You are not obligated to perform the symbol they've built. You are also not required to resent them for having built it, since the mechanism operates largely outside conscious control. What actually helps, both for you and for them, is a gentle honesty, a willingness to exist as you actually are now rather than as the preserved version they've been carrying, even if that honesty disappoints an image that was never really accurate to begin with. There is something clarifying in understanding that being unforgettable to someone was likely never a verdict on your worth. It was, more precisely, a symptom of their own unfinished process, one that happened to use you as its temporary container. That doesn't make the connection meaningless. It simply relocates the meaning to where it actually belongs, in their ongoing relationship with themselves, rather than in some special quality you alone possessed. This is not a small realization, and it does not resolve as neatly as people often want it to. Some of the people who cannot forget you will eventually do the difficult work of integrating what you represented, and when they do, the fixation usually fades on its own, quietly, without any conversation required. Others never will, and will continue, for years or decades, revisiting the memory of you, the way people revisit an old photograph, not because the photograph itself has power, but because looking at it is easier than looking at what it represents directly. Somewhere right now, someone is thinking of a version of you that no longer entirely exists, preserved carefully in a moment that meant more to them than it ever did to you, and they have no way of knowing that you have changed just as much as they have, that the person they cannot forget was only ever a fragment of who you actually were, glimpsed briefly, at exactly the moment they needed to see it. They may never come looking for the update, or they might, someday, and discover that the real you was always more complicated, more ordinary, and more human than the symbol they built, which is, in the end, simply what happens whenever memory is asked to hold a person, rather than the harder, more honest work each person eventually has to do alone.